This week on Rural Ireland Matters, I wanted to talk about student accommodation. There's a lot of talk at the moment in relation to student accommodation in our towns and cities as people return to third level education. And it's often a subject that is raised now and then it's kind of forgotten about. But particularly within the Housing for All plan, it is a very important element. And just to give a bit of background, there was a fund announced earlier in the summer, a €75 million fund from the European Bank specifically for student accommodation. And of course it's part of the Housing for All plan because student accommodation is often coming from the private sector because our facilities on campuses are not sufficient. For example, UL has about 17,000 students and yet there is less than 3,000 places for students on campus. So how colleges developed and how universities developed have to take into account accommodation. But I suppose how this relates to rural Ireland specifically is nobody talks about the fact that the majority of students who are in a housing crisis are from rural areas. Now, obviously, there are students who move between cities and are in cities and then decide to move to another city for university or college, and they face the same problems. But the majority of the time, many students who live in cities and have those options of going to university close by choose to go to university in the city that they live in because of the accommodation crisis. So it is very much a rural Ireland issue. And as a country and as a government, our priority is being for equal opportunities for our citizens when they go about pursuing something as basic as education. And really, it doesn't give equal opportunity to rural students because they are at a disadvantage in terms of access to education. So it is an issue that really has to be addressed. It's at crisis point, as the Students' Union has highlighted. They did a protest outside the Dáil recently, and more recently, in the last couple of days, the Students' Union in Cork and UCC had to reopen their food bank with a heavy heart because students are suffering and are finding it difficult to make ends meet in terms of accommodation, in terms of costs, and also to feed themselves. So this is a very difficult situation for students and their parents. And as I said, the majority of them are coming from rural families. So it is very much a rural Ireland issue, the issue of student accommodation in our cities and major towns. And this really needs to be addressed as part of the Housing for All plan. And if we don't give access to education for everyone and equal opportunity, it is a very unfair and unbalanced situation. And we need to address this as part of the housing strategy. But my fear is that it gets forgotten about as the student population returns to colleges, and after a few months it's all forgotten about, and those students that are in hotels or B&Bs that are paying exorbitant fees, and yet there isn't enough follow-up as to why students drop out of college in terms of whether it's an academic issue or whether it is simply cost of living and not being able to make ends meet and not being able to make the student rent that is required. Now, a lot of students work part-time, and that can be very difficult depending on their course. Also, in the whole housing issue that I've talked about before, we really need to include the construction industry more in this debate. I'm very much pro-business. I don't believe that every construction company or every investor is just a profit hungry organization, and that, you know, yes, we need to pay construction properly, we need to pay the people properly, and those who are investing are looking to make a profit. That is fine, but there's also a balance, and it is up to government to put that balance in place and ensure that the accommodation is created in such a way that it allows students to get access to affordable accommodation. I mean, a really disturbing fact is that planning authority, and the fact that the department has had to write, the Department of Housing has had to write to local authorities and councils and remind them that student accommodation, planning permission, and projects that have been created under student accommodation must be used for student accommodation into the future. And the problem with student accommodation being turned into tourist accommodation is just ridiculous. Like that you would not put that stipulation, and that there wouldn't be heavy penalties or a court case against any private sector industry that would turn accommodation from student accommodation to tourist accommodation without a valid reason. You know, obviously if there was no demand, you'd have to make the case that it would be turned into tourist accommodation. But when that doesn't happen, and that councils have to be reminded of that fact, given the level of hoops that a lot of private individuals, as I've talked about before, have to go through when it comes to planning applications and meeting planning criteria, this seems very unfair. And we really do have to sit down with the construction industry. And I completely understand, and in relation to the costs of construction. And this is where smart thinking and intelligent cooperation between the construction industry and government needs to happen, in terms of how student accommodation gets built, and obviously housing gets built as part of the Ireland the Housing for All plan, because they feed into each other. Because if there's more student accommodation available, well, then there's less private houses that go into student accommodation, and then therefore there's more houses available for regular families or couples to live in. So therefore that conversation needs to happen. Of course, like the cost of steel has gone up by 100% in recent months. There's issues around Brexit and transport and COVID. Of course that has happened, but we have to deal with the situation as it is. So therefore we need to look at solutions between construction and the industry and government to find ways that buildings can happen, that things can get built, that planning can get through, but also, because it is an emergency for everyone, but also that the construction industry can pay their staff and make a profit, because they're in business, because the taxes they pay go back into government. So we have to be pro-business, but in a controlled environment. And, you know, the argument, oh, well, people won't get into it. As long as there is an acceptable level of profit to be made, business will happen, people will participate, people will engage in that industry. So it is really a holistic approach that's required to ensure that all of those are met. And it is about sitting down with the construction industry and ensuring that all the issues that are there are worked out, because my fear is that this issue is left to one side again once we get into the academic year. And if we don't have the next generation of students who are able to go to college, because our mantra as public representatives and as a government should be equal opportunities for our citizens, to enable them to reach their full potential, to have that college experience, to gain an education. And that's extremely important. So we have to come up with solutions in relation to the student crisis to ensure that, and as I said, it is The reality is it is particularly a problem for people coming from rural Ireland. And I suppose this is about rural Ireland matters. So this is why I highlight this in this way. And of course, other city students do come up against this issue when they move to other cities. But as I said, in the majority of cases, they have options in terms of courses and education that simply students coming from rural areas do not have. The reality is, even with blended learning and online learning, the reality, and to have that student experience and that coming of age and that all that happens in college and that connection with other young people and the learnings and the life lessons that happen, the reality is they have to move to our bigger cities and towns. So it is particularly a rural Ireland issue, and rural Ireland matters.